everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Brittany, and in this video I will be showing you how I challenged myself in the process of trying to recreate one of my favorite pins from my Pinterest board. I decided to do this challenge and project for myself because I really want to push some new skills I've acquired and want to develop further, which are pattern making skills and new sewing construction skills. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my channel if you like sewing and DIY projects. And I think I'll be continuing this series on my channel where I try to recreate pins from my Pinterest board to try to further these skills. So if you want to come along for that journey, I invite you to subscribe. If you recall from one of my recent videos, I recently acquired, willingly, a textbook called Pattern Making for Fashion Design, which was written by Helen Joseph Armstrong. In this book, Armstrong goes over in great detail any and everything you would need to know about how to create sewing patterns that are made for the modern wardrobe and can be tailored specific to your exact measurements. I can quite confidently say that this textbook has been a tremendous catalyst in my recent ability to create custom sewing patterns. I went from struggling with the fit of commercial patterns and trying to haphazardly customize the fit of these patterns to being able to produce this dress in this video in just a matter of a couple of months. So, for the reason you clicked on this video, now on to the dress. How did I manage to dupe this gorgeous dress from my pin on my Pinterest board, which I later discovered is called the Claudette dress from a brand of her own kind? A bit of a disclaimer here, I give full credit of the design and concept of this dress to the brand of her own kind, and I will link the shop in the description box below. They are a slow fashion house in Brooklyn, New York, and they create timeless, heirloom quality pieces with a focus on sustainability and using classic dressmaking techniques. I highly encourage you to check them out if you'd like to purchase this dress. The purpose of this video is to serve as educational content, particularly on the topic of sewing and how to create sewing patterns. All credit goes to Of Her Own Kind where credit is due. So back to the dress. What techniques and methods did I use to recreate this dress? First things first, I needed fabric. I didn't want just any fabric. I wanted fabric with the following qualities. Number 1, natural fibers, mainly linen, but I was willing to go with a blend as well. Number 2, light to medium weight. Looking at the dress on the website for Of Her Own Kind, you can see that the dress has fairly fluid drape to it. Number 3, off-white in color, just like the picture in the photo. Number 4, opaque. I didn't want to have to worry about sheerness of fabric and worrying about which undergarments to wear. In retrospect, this was a bit of an issue that we can go into later. Number 5, slub and texture. Looking at the fabric that Of Her Own Kind used on this dress, which was a raw silk, there's quite a lot of texture on the fabric. Given that raw silk is very expensive and I didn't have that budget for this kind of project, I decided to try to find a fabric with similar texture, but in lower price. I ended up purchasing a linen viscose blend from an Etsy shop called Lyrical Fabrics. I ordered 4 yards and pretty much used all of it. Shipping was fast and communication was quick as well from the owner, and I got all of the aforementioned qualities in this fabric that I was looking for, with the exception, slightly, of the opaqueness. Now that I had acquired the fabric, I needed to move on to creating the sewing pattern, the hard part. Looking at the bodice of the dress first, you can clearly see there are seams that go along the bust vertically and in the equivalent spot on the back of the bodice. These seams are called princess seams. Furthermore, you can see that the seams of this bodice go into the arm side of the bodice rather than the shoulder that is also sometimes seen in princess seam garments. Luckily, Armstrong's book has a very detailed section on how to take a basic 2-dart bodice and transform it into a princess seam pattern. To roughly describe this process, you simply draw a style line from the middle of the waist dart up into the arm side, creating a nice smooth curve, and then you cut along the style line, creating 2 new pieces which serve as your pattern. After these pieces are cut, all that needs to happen is some shaping on these pieces, which is described in great detail in the book. This is then repeated on the back, making a total of 4 pieces for the bodice. In addition to using Armstrong's book as a reference for this technique, I also used fellow YouTube creator The Closet Historian's recent video on how to create princess seam bodice patterns. It was great to have that visual reference of how to do this, given that the techniques she used in her video come from the same exact textbook by Armstrong. Further analysis of this dress, you can see that the waistline is a bit more complicated than a simple straight line. The waistline is curved and dips at the front and the back, creating a corset-like shape. To recreate this, I lined up all 4 pieces from my bodice in the correct orientation, making sure to align all the seams, and then I taped extra paper at the bottom of the pieces at the waistline. I then simply sketched using a French ruler the shape that I was going for and cut along these lines. Upon a couple of mock-ups later, I would refine this shape even more. Now that the pattern pieces for the bodice were complete, it was time to start on the pattern pieces for the skirt. There was a bit of trial and error for this part, as Armstrong's book didn't exactly delve into this exact technique that was used on this skirt. However, upon inspection of the skirt, I could tell two things. Number one, it was a rather full skirt and long, and number two, there were two tiers that made up the skirt, which had gathering at the top of each tier. I looked at various photos of models wearing this dress, and given the way that it draped from their waistline, or given the way it draped when they held it out to their sides, it appeared to be a half-circle skirt. I'd like to point out this was just a complete guess. I really have no way of knowing this or verifying this. So with this guess in mind, I used Armstrong's book to draft a simple sewing pattern for a half-circle skirt tailored to my measurements. I then cut this pattern in half, where one half would represent the front of the skirt and the other half would represent the back of the skirt. Next, it was time to tackle the style lines and where to put the tiers in the skirt. Upon simple observation of some photos, it was pretty clear to me where the style lines were. It seemed to dip in the front and the back and raise at the sides. With this in mind, I laid out my front and back pieces and began to sketch a style line. With the style lines of the tiers implemented, I had two further things to address with the skirt. Number one, how would I make sure the simple waistline of my skirt at this point matched the curves of the corset-like bodice? And number two, how would I adjust the gathers on the tiers? I decided to tackle the former first. I labeled the center front, center back, and side seams of each half of the skirt, and these served as reference points for me. I then layered each bodice piece over these skirt pieces, being sure to match up these reference points. With all reference points matched, all I had to do was simply trace the shape of the waistline from the bodice and reflect that onto the waistline of the skirt. I simply cut off the extra paper from the skirt that was no longer needed. Now that the waistline of the skirt matched the curved waistline of the bodice, I could adjust the gathering on each of the tiers of the skirt. Looking in Armstrong's book, there was plenty of information on how to add fullness to garments and a more detailed section on how to implement gathers to create this fullness. To briefly describe this technique, I'll use a quick example with a rectangle. You would simply cut into the rectangle in a few spots, from the top to the bottom, being sure not to cut all the way through the bottom line. Then you simply spread the pieces along the top to create this extra fullness. This can be done in any ratio you like. I decided to go with a ratio of 1.5 as I didn't want too much fullness in this skirt or it would be rather heavy. So, given this ratio in this example, you would take the length of the bottom line of the rectangle, multiply it by 1.5, and then that is the amount that you should spread the top pieces to create this fullness. Using this technique, I cut into the style lines that I drafted earlier for the tiers, which gave me a total of 4 pattern pieces for the skirt at this point. And just as I described with the example with the rectangle, I simply cut into the top of each of these pattern pieces and spread them out at a ratio of 1.5. These 4 pieces were rather large at this point, so I was worried maybe I added too much fullness to the skirt. However, with a couple of mock-ups, I deemed it to be fine and it was almost an exact match, in my opinion, to the fullness of the skirt in the photos. I was almost done with the pattern pieces at this point, however, I needed to tackle one more thing I haven't addressed yet, which was the button extensions. This was a very task for me to do as I have just done a lot of research on this topic for my previous video, which I'll link in the top right if you're curious to watch that. Given I just documented how to do this, I'm going to skip over this for this part of the video. Now that I've successfully drafted all the pattern pieces and I created a couple of mock-ups, I could finally begin on making the dress. I began by laying out my fabric, folded in half selvage to selvage, being sure to make it as smooth as possible, and then I laid my pattern pieces as strategically as possible, given that I had some fabric length limitations. This was a bit tricky as I had to resort to laying some pieces on opposite grain lines, but I had to make do with the fabric that I had. After struggling with nerves for a few minutes, I decided to finally cut into the fabric. My pattern pieces were not drafted with seam allowances in mind, so I had to draft this on the fabric as I cut. Cutting out the pieces of fabric in the fashion fabric and the lining alone took me 1.5 hours. I was trying to be as accurate as possible and take my time. I really had no room for slip-ups because I didn't have that much fabric to work with. After all of my pattern pieces were cut out, I could begin on the construction of the dress. I really took my time constructing the dress because I was really inspired by the original dress, which was described to be of heirloom quality. I used much smaller stitches than usual, pressed at every seam possible, and used some other finishing techniques I'll go into to make sure that this garment could really last a lifetime. I began with the bodice, taking my time and being sure to match up those tricky curved edges at the seam lines rather than the edges. I actually snipped a little bit into the seam line of each of the bodice pieces so I could more easily match these reference points up together. Once the bodice was complete, I could move on to repeating all the same exact steps for the lining. The bodice was the only piece that I lined, and I used some leftover cotton lawn from a previous project I did, which I also documented on my channel, and if you're curious to watch that, I will also link that video in the top right. I then stitched the outer layer of the bodice to the lining, being sure to not stitch along the straps so I could turn it inside out later, and being sure to leave ample room to deal with the button extension later. Before I could tackle this button extension, I needed to interface the pieces that would be part of the button extension. To be quite honest, I was not sure at all how to construct this part of the bodice because Armstrong's book doesn't really go into great detail about how to construct button garments, but it does go into great deal about how to draft them. After perusing the internet for a bit, I came across a video by fellow YouTube creator Just Dang, whose tutorials have proven their value to me over and over again. I've previously used her as a resource to create this milkmaid dress, which I created about a couple months ago, and I can link a video for that as well in the top right corner. The video I found from Just Dang delved into how to make this style dress, which was very similar to the dress that I was working on. Using this video as a resource, I essentially followed the exact same instructions that she provided in her video and applied them to my garment with great success. To describe it roughly, you press the seam allowance into place, cut into the seam allowance of the lining to release it so you can put the lining and the fashion fabric right sides together, fold the placket in half with right sides together, stitch across the top, trim the extra fabric, and then you can turn it right back side out to reveal a beautiful placket. I also did an extra step of trimming some extra lining fabric because I was worried the button extension would become too bulky. With the plackets dealt with on the bodice, the last step was to assemble the straps, which if you recall, were not sewed yet so I could turn the whole garment right side out. This required some hand stitching in the form of a slip stitch. Brittany from 2 years ago would have tried to avoid this step at all costs, but Brittany today rather likes hand stitching. It's a great way to focus on an easy task, to take your mind off the stress of life, which, given the state of this country in the past few weeks, we could all use. With the bodice completed, I could move on to assembling the skirt. I began by sewing the skirt entirely together with the exception of the center front, which was allotted for the button extension, and with the exception of the tiers, which I had to gather first. I used French seams for this step to improve the longevity of this garment, and I'd never done this before, but it proved to be quite simple. I then had to construct the button extension for the top and bottom tiers of the skirt, which were much more simpler than the bodice, given that I did not have a lining to deal with. After the top and bottom half of the skirt was assembled, it was time to move on to all of the gathering stitches, and there was a lot. Beginning on the top tier, I did 2 rows of gathering stitches all the way from center front to center front. I then gathered this by hand, being sure to hold the bobbin threads taut as I evenly dispersed the fabric. I really took time to match all of the seams and to make sure I was evenly distributing the fabric to ensure that the dress hung nicely when I wore it, and this alone took me a half hour. I then attached the top half of the tier of the skirt to the waistline of the bodice, being sure to match all seams perfectly where applicable. I then used bias binding to conceal all of these raw edges at the seam line, again with the goal of increasing the longevity of the dress. I then repeated all these steps for the bottom half of the skirt, and with that, I basically had a fully assembled dress. The next step was to address the buttons. I purchased coconut shell buttons with the intention of keeping the integrity of this sustainability thing going. I then roughly estimated how many buttons I should use and where to place them simply by laying the dress on the floor, placing the buttons along the button extension where I wanted, and getting a rough gauge estimate of how it would look. After this rough approximation, I then took the time to evenly spread the buttons along the button extension, being sure to measure and make sure all the space between the buttons was even. I then started the work of creating all of those buttonholes, and there were quite a lot. And luckily my modern sewing machine has a computerized stitch for this purpose. While this step was technically easy because the sewing machine did all the work, it was rather tedious, as I've learned previously that my needles love to break when I create buttonholes, so I had to go very slowly. After that, it was as simple as sewing the buttons into place by hand, adding a cotton lace trim to the bottom of the dress. All in all, I am thrilled with how this dress turned out. I really love it. For lack of better words, it's very prairie chic to me, and the corset style bodice is very flattering. This also served as a valuable lesson in the amount of time and labor it takes to create a dress from start to finish. The next time I see a $30 dress at Target, I'm going to question who got abused in that system when creating that dress. I urge you to try to lower your consumption of fashion and clothing, even though social media really tries to influence you to purchase almost every week with every new launch that happens. I think it would be better to rather focus those efforts on acquiring high-quality, timeless items that can last in your wardrobe for years to come. However, I know and am aware of the socioeconomic factors that come into play here, and people don't have the privilege of being able to spend that kind of money on garments. It's a tricky area to process. The goal of this project was to really push my pattern making skills and to try to further develop them. I forget where I originally heard this, but I really resonate with the phrase, "You're not growing if you're not uncomfortable." I really had to get out of my comfort zone when creating this sewing pattern because I was using techniques I've literally never used before, and this is all a very new territory for me as of the past few months. But you have to start somewhere, and it's usually going to be a very uncomfortable territory. If you'd like to follow along on my journey, and I think I will be continuing this as a series where I try to recreate pins from my Pinterest board, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel, and if you want to be notified when I upload, go ahead and click the bell. Again, this video is for educational purposes only. I will not be distributing this sewing pattern or trying to sell this dress as my own brand or anything like that, and all credit goes to Of Her Own Kind. Go ahead and check out the link in my description box below where I'll link to Of Her Own Kind's website. All credit should go to that brand where it's due. Thanks for stopping by my channel today, and I hope you have a great day.